Finally forced out. The former Prince, now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, has officially left Royal Lodge and will live in a home on Sandringham Estate in Norfolk.
The gates of Royal Lodge have witnessed more than 2 centuries of royal history. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what's unfolding behind those walls right now. A prince stripped of his titles, a king forced to exile his own brother, and a residence that's become the battleground for the biggest royal crisis since World War I. Are you ready to discover what's really happening? Because what comes next could change the monarchy forever. The Royal Lodge dream. How it all began. Think about this for a moment. What would you do with a 30-room mansion in one of Britain's most exclusive locations? For Prince Andrew, this wasn't just a dream. It was reality for over 20 years. Royal Lodge isn't just any property. This Grade 2 listed Georgian masterpiece sits within Windsor Great Park like a crown jewel. 30 beautifully appointed rooms, 7 bedrooms, a sunken garden that would make any landscape architect weep with envy, its own private chapel, a swimming pool, an aviary, 6 separate lodge cottages, even dedicated accommodations for protection officers. But here's where it gets interesting. This mansion carried something far more valuable than luxury. It carried legacy. Queen Elizabeth herself grew up within these very walls. Princess Margaret ran through these same corridors as a child. The Queen Mother called it home until her death in 2002. When Andrew moved in during 2003, he secured what many considered the deal of the century, a 75-year lease stretching all the way to June 15, 2078. The upfront cost? £1 million. The annual rent? Here's where your jaw should drop. Something called peppercorn rent, if demanded. Do you know what peppercorn rent means? It's essentially symbolic, nominal, almost nothing. Andrew was living in a multi-million-pound mansion for virtually free. His ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, joined him in 2008, and together they created something unusual, a divorced couple living together in royal splendor, raising eyebrows but maintaining an arrangement that somehow worked. For 2 decades, this setup seemed untouchable. Andrew had his legal lease. He had his prestigious address. He had everything, or so he thought. The scandal that changed everything. Fast forward to 2024. Britain is struggling through a devastating cost of living crisis. Ordinary families are choosing between heating and eating. And then the public learns that Prince Andrew, embroiled in scandal, no longer performing royal duties, is living essentially rent-free in a mansion worth millions. Can you imagine the outrage? Can you feel the fury of taxpayers discovering this arrangement while they're struggling to pay their own mortgages? The backlash was immediate. It was fierce, and it was unrelenting. King Charles had been working behind the scenes for months, trying to persuade his younger brother to downsize. Move to something smaller, he suggested. Frogmore Cottage, perhaps? Something more appropriate for someone no longer representing the crown. But Andrew refused. His lease was ironclad, he believed. The law protected him. He wasn't going anywhere. Then came the memoir. Virginia Giuffre's book dropped in 2024 like a bomb, reigniting every terrible headline about Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein. The pressure on King Charles became unbearable. The British public demanded action. The Crown's reputation hung in the balance. Something had to give, and on October 30th, 2025, it did. October 30th, 2025. The day everything shattered. Picture the scene. Buckingham Palace releasing a statement so extraordinary that it made headlines across the globe within minutes. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. Let those words sink in. A reigning monarch stripping his own brother of royal titles. When was the last time something like this happened? You'd have to go back to 1917, over a century ago, when Prince Charles Edward lost his Duke of Albany title for fighting for Germany during World War I. This wasn't just unprecedented in modern times. This was seismic. The palace statement continued with devastating clarity. Prince Andrew will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. No more His Royal Highness. No more Duke of York. Just Andrew. And then came the hammer blow. Formal notice has now been served to surrender the lease, and he will move to alternative private accommodation. The legal protection Andrew had counted on? Worthless. The 75-year lease stretching to 2078? Terminated. The peppercorn rent arrangement? Over. But here's what made this announcement truly remarkable. The palace didn't just strip Andrew's titles, they explicitly aligned with his accusers. The king and queen want everyone to know that they care deeply about the victims and survivors of all types of mistreatments. This was the royal family choosing sides, and they weren't choosing Andrew's. The 12-month countdown. Andrew was given 12 months to vacate. October 2026 was his deadline, but sources close to King Charles revealed something crucial. The king hoped Andrew would leave much sooner, ideally by Easter 2025. Why the urgency? What was driving Charles to push his brother out so quickly? Sarah Ferguson, who had stood by Andrew through everything, suddenly lost her Duchess of York title. Friends reported she was devastated, turning to her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, for support. The collateral damage was spreading. Questions swirled. Would Andrew be compensated for the millions he'd invested in renovating Royal Lodge over the years? The Crown Estate launched an assessment to determine the property's condition and calculate potential compensation. But as investigators examined Royal Lodge, they discovered something nobody expected: the hoarding crisis. A secret revealed. When removal vans began appearing at Royal Lodge's gates in late 2025, disturbing stories started leaking out. Stories that painted a shocking picture of what had been happening inside that mansion for years. Multiple insiders used the same word: hoarder. Can you imagine? Room after room piled to the ceiling with documents and photographs. Possessions accumulated over decades stuffed into every available space. What should have been a straightforward move had become an archaeological excavation. One friend told reporters, "The clutter at Royal Lodge is turning what should be a straightforward move into a months-long room-by-room excavation." Another source added something even more revealing. Even if Andrew wanted to move tomorrow, he couldn't because of the sheer volume of possessions requiring careful sorting. Think about what this reveals. Here's a man who stepped back from royal duties in 2019, a man who'd been increasingly isolated from public life, and he'd been retreating into his collection of documents and photographs, clinging to remnants of his former existence. This wasn't just about clutter. This was about mental state, about coping mechanisms, about a prince who couldn't let go of who he used to be. The practical implications were staggering. King Charles had envisioned a relatively quick transition, but the hoarding situation meant the process would drag on until at least Andrew's 66th birthday on February 19, 2026, if not longer. Storage units were arranged for overflow items. Decisions had to be made about what to keep versus what to discard. Every room required careful, systematic clearing. And here's the kicker. The Crown Estate's assessment concluded that Andrew would likely receive zero compensation for surrendering his lease early, despite paying £1 million up front and investing millions more in renovations. The property's condition didn't meet lease standards. The dilapidations, the deterioration, the hoarding damage would cancel out any compensation he might have expected. He was losing everything and getting nothing back. Marsh Farm. The shocking truth about Andrew's new home. When news broke about Andrew's destination, royal watchers couldn't believe it. Marsh Farm, a small working farm in Wolferton, approximately 2 miles west of Sandringham House, unoccupied for years after the previous tenant farmer died, described by those who'd seen it as ramshackle and significantly run down. Let's put this in perspective. Andrew was moving from 30 rooms in a Georgian mansion to what friends called a shoebox-sized house, from his own private chapel to a property barely large enough for him alone, from a swimming pool, aviary, and sunken garden to a modest farmhouse, requiring extensive renovation just to be habitable. Sources revealed something crucial. He really didn't want Marsh Farm. What Andrew actually wanted was Wood Farm, Prince Philip's former retirement home. Larger, more comfortable, closer to Sandringham House. But here's where it gets interesting. Wood Farm was denied specifically because it would place Andrew too close to the royal family during occasions like Christmas. Do you see what that means? The 2-mile distance to Marsh Farm wasn't accidental. It was calculated, deliberate. A buffer zone designed to keep Andrew isolated from the rest of the family. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams stated it plainly. Keeping Andrew at Sandringham was one way of, in a sense, controlling him. By January 2026, construction crews descended on Marsh Farm. At least 6 workmen toiling in the rain, installing security features, making repairs. A new 6-foot fence replaced barbed wire. CCTV cameras went up throughout the property. Surveillance systems were integrated. But the problems were mounting. The property lacked suitable garaging for Andrew's luxury vehicles, something that hasn't gone down well with him. It wasn't large enough for live-in staff. So King Charles planned to provide a cleaner, groundsman, and cook from Sandringham on an ad hoc basis. Can you imagine the psychological impact? Andrew had never managed his own household independently. He'd grown up in Buckingham Palace with staff attending to every need. Now he'd be dependent on help coming and going, according to a schedule determined by his brother. One source summarized it perfectly. One thing for sure is that it is a lot smaller and less luxurious than Royal Lodge. Another added, he won't have lived anywhere that small since he left his apartment at Buckingham Palace, and then he had free roam of the building and grounds. The environmental nightmare nobody saw coming. Just when you think this story couldn't get more dramatic, January 2026 brought news that sent shockwaves through royal circles. Marsh Farm sits on a floodplain. A flood risk assessment from 2024 for Wolferton Barnes, just meters from Marsh Farm, stated explicitly that the Environment Agency operates a flood warning system to enable householders to protect life or act to manage the effect of flooding on property. This wasn't theoretical. This was real danger officially recognized by environmental authorities. The assessment detailed specific risks. Failure of Wolferton pumping station may occur due to long-term mechanical breakdown or power supply being disrupted. If that critical system failed, properties like Marsh Farm would be directly threatened by flooding. The document concluded that if conditions put properties and land at risk of flooding, emergency action would be taken using temporary pumping equipment. Let that sink in. Andrew's safety from flooding relied on a pumping station that might break down at any time, plus emergency equipment and staff to help if it did. And here's the timing that makes this truly remarkable. Storm Chandra hit Britain with fierce winds and heavy rain just as this news emerged. King Charles had to shut down the children's play area at Sandringham Estate because conditions were too dangerous. Royal watchers noted with alarm, Andrew's flooding woes would have deepened as Storm Chandra struck, demonstrating in real time the weather events that could threaten his new home. Questions exploded. Had environmental risks been properly assessed before selecting Marsh Farm? Was the king aware of the flooding vulnerability? And if he was aware, why place a family member in a property with such obvious risks when other properties on the Sandringham estate were available? Some commentators suggested something darker. The choice of Marsh Farm, despite its flood risks, might have been deliberate, part of a strategy to make Andrew's life uncomfortable enough that he might eventually choose to leave the United Kingdom entirely. The security nightmare. Environmental risks weren't the only concern. Security experts raised serious alarms about Marsh Farm's vulnerability. Authorities took the extraordinary step of extending Sandringham's no-fly zone to include Marsh Farm, preventing drones from surveilling the property. This move became necessary after drones were spotted over Sandringham in March 2025 during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to King Charles. The new legislation covering Marsh Farm was made on September 16, 2025, and came into force on September 22nd, weeks before Andrew's titles were formally stripped. That timing is crucial. It means planning for Andrew's move had been underway long before the public announcement. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was calculated, orchestrated. The order stated that the Secretary of State has decided that it is necessary in the public interest to amend the restricted area. An explanatory note added that Flying should be restricted in the vicinity of the specified areas for reasons of public safety and security. But experts questioned whether Marsh Farm could ever be made as secure as Royal Lodge, with its established infrastructure and position within protected Windsor Great Park. Marsh Farm sat 2 miles from Sandringham House.
Andrew, moving up here to Sandringham, as you say, the people of Sandringham are
on an isolated rural property, making rapid response to any security incident far more difficult. Sources indicated that King Charles would be funding Andrew's accommodation and security privately, rather than through public money, representing a significant ongoing expense. Here's an irony. It might actually have been more cost-effective to let Andrew remain at Royal Lodge.
Hello, Buckingham Palace had said Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's move from Royal Lodge would be early this year,
where security was already established. Sarah Ferguson's stunning decision. Throughout everything, one relationship had seemed unshakable: Andrew's bond with ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. Sarah had stood by him through years of scandal. She'd lived at Royal Lodge since 2008 in what they described as a close friendship. She'd defended him publicly when others abandoned him. But in January 2026, exclusive reports revealed a bombshell. Sarah would not be accompanying Andrew to Marsh Farm. A source stated, "Andrew and Sarah have to move out by the 25th of January, and she has stood by him all these years, but is now ready to spread her wings. She won't be moving in with him to the new house on the Sandringham estate." After losing her Duchess of York title and facing her own uncertain future, Sarah was seeking support from Beatrice and Eugenie. Sources said she would not be moving in with Beatrice in the Cotswolds, but was making her own plans in Windsor. The separation marked the end of their unique post-divorce relationship. They'd maintained closeness since their 1996 divorce, nearly 30 years of friendship and co-parenting. Sarah had shown extraordinary loyalty during the Epstein scandal, but even her loyalty had its limits. For Andrew, losing Sarah's constant presence represented yet another devastating blow. She'd been his companion, his public defender, someone who understood the unique pressures of royal life. Without her at Marsh Farm, Andrew would be profoundly isolated. The timing of Sarah's decision raises a haunting question. Did she know something about Marsh Farm, or Andrew's long-term prospects that made her unwilling to tie her fate to his any longer? The complete loss of everything. Let's catalog exactly what Andrew is losing. At Royal Lodge, he enjoyed a private swimming pool where he could exercise in complete privacy. Gone. An aviary where he kept birds. Gone. A beautiful sunken garden cultivated over years. Gone. The Royal Chapel of All Saints for private worship. Gone, meaning he'll need to travel elsewhere for religious services, potentially exposing him to public view and media attention. 6 lodge cottages that housed staff and guests. Gone. A gardener's cottage and police accommodation integrated into the property's infrastructure. Gone. Live-in staff who attended to his needs around the clock. Gone. Replaced by ad hoc assistance from Sandringham staff on a schedule he doesn't control. Suitable garaging for his luxury vehicles. Gone. But most significantly, his independence, his autonomy, his dignity. Friends indicated the reality of Marsh Farm had hit Andrew hard. The phrase, "he really didn't want Marsh Farm," captured his deep reluctance, but the formal eviction notice left him no choice. Royal experts noted that King Charles' choice of Marsh Farm sent a clear message to the wider public and other royals. Titles and privileges come with expectations of behavior. Fail to meet those expectations, and you'll face swift, severe, and permanent consequences. The isolation strategy. Royal commentators increasingly concluded that Marsh Farm represented a deliberate strategy of isolation and control. By placing Andrew at a remote farmhouse 2 miles from Sandringham House.
This is the big one. GB News can confirm that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has relocated to a property on the Sandringham estate.
King Charles was signaling that Andrew's exile would be geographic, as well as social and ceremonial. The deliberate nature became apparent when reports emerged that Andrew had requested Wood Farm, but was denied specifically because it was too close to the rest of the royal family. This rejection revealed Charles's thinking clearly. Andrew could have accommodation on the Sandringham estate, but it needed to be far enough that he wouldn't accidentally encounter other royals. The 2-mile distance was the minimum acceptable buffer zone. The isolation extended beyond physical distance. While Royal Lodge had been in Windsor, where Andrew built connections over 2 decades, Marsh Farm was in a rural area where Andrew had no established relationships. He'd be starting over socially at age 65 or 66. The move to Norfolk also meant Andrew would be far from his daughters, who both maintained residences in or around London and had been important sources of support. Friends indicated Andrew was well aware of the isolation strategy and might ultimately choose to leave the United Kingdom entirely. One friend said, "He could relocate to the Middle East where he has long-established business contacts." This possibility was taken seriously enough that royal experts discussed it as a realistic scenario. Andrew had maintained relationships in countries like Dubai and the UAE, connections that potentially offered him a life where his scandal might not follow him quite so relentlessly. The ultimate revelation: Marsh Farm as temporary housing. In a stunning development in mid-January 2026, reports suggested that Marsh Farm might not even be Andrew's permanent residence, but rather temporary or interim accommodation, while something else was being arranged. Let that sink in. After all this drama, all this expense, all these renovations, Marsh Farm might just be temporary. This revelation raised profound questions about King Charles's true intentions. Sources indicated Andrew would be offered temporary accommodation on the Sandringham estate while renovation work continued, either on Marsh Farm or potentially on some other property. The precise location of this interim housing remained unclear. This meant Andrew's housing crisis was far from over. He might face additional moves and uncertainties in the months ahead. The prospect of being shifted from one temporary property to another represented a new form of instability that must be deeply unsettling. Some observers interpreted the temporary designation as evidence that King Charles hadn't yet made final decisions about handling his brother long-term. The extensive renovations at Marsh Farm seemed inconsistent with it being truly temporary. The investment in security fencing, CCTV, and improvements wouldn't make sense for brief occupancy. Another interpretation, describing Marsh Farm as temporary, was a face-saving measure allowing Andrew to accept the move without completely giving up hope that his circumstances might improve. By framing the farmhouse as interim accommodation, the King's team could present it as a reasonable short-term solution rather than Andrew's permanent fate. Royal experts noted that describing Andrew's housing as temporary left options open for future adjustments if circumstances changed, if Andrew's health deteriorated, if security threats increased, if flooding made Marsh Farm genuinely unlivable, or if public opinion shifted. What this all really means. The ultimate warning that Marsh Farm represents isn't just about flooding risks, inadequate garaging, or isolation. It's about fundamental uncertainty and instability that now defines Andrew's entire existence. He's gone from being a prince with a secure home and clear role to being someone whose housing is temporary, whose titles have been stripped, whose future is uncertain, and whose very presence in the United Kingdom might be negotiable. Marsh Farm symbolizes not just a smaller house, but a fundamentally diminished and precarious status that could change again at any time. Think about the complete transformation, from 30 rooms to a shoebox, from peppercorn rent to complete dependence on his brother's charity, from royal duties to exile, from prince to simply Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
Police are assessing those allegations that a woman was sent by Jeffrey Epstein to meet Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
And here's what makes this truly explosive. What Andrew does next could determine the monarchy's future. Will he accept his exile quietly, fading into obscurity at Marsh Farm? Will he fight back legally, creating a public spectacle that damages the crown? Will he give interviews, write a memoir, make revelations that shake the royal family to its core? Or will he leave the United Kingdom entirely, potentially beyond the family's control. King Charles has taken unprecedented action against his own brother, but the question remains: has he created a solution or merely delayed an inevitable explosion? Because a disgraced prince with nothing left to lose, isolated, stripped of titles, facing floods and uncertainty, is perhaps the most dangerous kind of royal. Your turn. Which aspect of Andrew's eviction shocks you most? The flood risks? The hoarding crisis? Sarah Ferguson abandoning him? The temporary housing revelation? Do you think King Charles is handling this situation appropriately? Or should he have made different arrangements for his disgraced brother? And here's the bigger question: what do you think Andrew will do next? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story is far from over, and your perspective matters. Remember to like this video, share it with anyone fascinated by royal drama, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this unprecedented crisis. Because one thing is certain: the crown has never faced anything quite like this, and how it ends could change the monarchy forever. Click the next video on your screen for more explosive royal revelations. Trust us, you won't want to miss it.